Welcome to Full PreFrontal, the show that exposes the mysteries of executive functions. This show is a collection of conversations about the role of the prefrontal cortex, which impacts your focus, planning, problem-solving, emotional balance, and independence. These conversations will introduce mental tools that will empower you to shift your mindset for a successful life. And now, here's your host, Sucheta Kamath.
All right, welcome back to Full PreFrontal, where we are exposing the mysteries of executive function. As always, I am here with our host, Sucheta Kamath. Good morning, Sucheta. Good to be with you.
Great to be with you, Todd. How are you doing?
I am doing great. I am very much looking forward to this conversation. Just the energy we got from our pre-show chat with our guest has me all excited. So kick us off. What are we talking about today?
Well, let me tell you a funny story, and this is a real story. So as you know already, that I was born and raised in India, and I have these friends who happen to have business in Japan. So this friend of mine went to Japan, and with a friend who lives in Japan, they met together, and this was his first night, and they decided to take the train or subway or whatever it is, and it was his first time. And so when they arrived at the station, they took the flight of stairs, they ran downstairs, and the train was about to close. The doors were about to close. And so just as any Indian would do, my friend put his leg in between the door, and the door opened, and they got in, and they were so happy that they made it. They sat down, and of course, unbeknownst to them, the train had shut down. And so they thought maybe it's delayed because of some other reasons, and they were yapping with each other. And then suddenly 2 police officers came. They asked my friend for his passport, and they asked him to vacate the train, and took him to this train station, police station, I guess. I don't know what it was, and they asked, do you know why we asked you to come with us? And my friend was clueless. He was, first of all, freaking out because he didn't do anything illegal, or he was literally FOB, fresh off the boat. And so he couldn't believe that he was in trouble. And so they turned on the TV in the room, and they played this video of him putting his leg in between the 2 doors and the doors opening. And you won't believe it. He was made to sit there for half a day watching the same video again and again. And afterwards, he was asked, are you going to do this again? And my friend was so freaked out by this whole thing, because if you did this in India, first of all, there are no cops to be found. There's no room with a video camera or a video recording that you can replay. And so he absolutely swore that he'll never do it again. And since then, he's been doing business there for the last 10 years. And yes, he has never put his leg in between the train door. Why I'm telling you this story? Because we are going to talk about what is allowable and what is not allowable is decided by not one person, but a group. And we call that group a culture. It becomes a system in which we operate. And particularly if you're a foreigner in that system, you have to kind of take the time to understand those rules, because they are mostly invisible, but you will be in trouble if you violate them. And that brings me to this amazing expert we have, and she studies norm psychology. Her name is Dr. Michele Gelfand. She's a distinguished university professor and professor of psychology at the University of Maryland, College Park. Dr. Gelfand uses field, experimental, computational, and neuroscience methods to understand the evolution of culture and its multi-level consequences. What I really love about this is, unlike most psychological experiments, people limit themselves to the experimental aspects of it, but she combines this field, computational, and neuroscience aspects. So she has wealth of knowledge about how the brain works, but how do people with brains behave in the cultural context. Her work has been published in outlets such as Science, Nature, Scientific Reports, Nature, Human Behavior, the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, Academy of Management Journal, etc., etc. She's very, very well published. She is the past president of the International Association for Conflict Management, past division chair of the Conflict Division of the Academy of Management, and past treasurer of the International Association for Cross-Cultural Psychology. The reason I'm listing a few things, I don't know how she finds time to do this in addition to the research she does. And she's a recipient of many, many celebrated awards. One particular one that I was in the audience, but I did not know her personally or had not reached out, was in 2016. She received the Diner Award from the Society for Personality and the Social Psychology. And in 2017, she received Outstanding International Psychologist Award from the APA, which is such an honor. Her work has been published in Science and was honored with the Gordon Allport Intergroup Relations Prize from the Society for Psychological Study of Social Issues. She is extremely well published, celebrated, and a fun person to talk to. So I can't wait to talk to her. And the most important thing we're going to discuss today is her fabulous book called Rule Makers and Rule Breakers: How Tight and Loose Cultures Wire the World, which is published recently. So we will have all this information in our show notes so people can look that up. So Dr. Michele Gelfand, welcome to Full Prefrontal.
Thank you so much for having me, Suchita.
So I have a question. I ask this of all my guests. How would you describe your own executive function skills? And when did you become aware of the norms or what the culture that you grew up in and what hold it has on you?
Well, that is such a great question. I like to say that, I'm sort of a New Yorker who escaped New York. And I like to compare my early life to this New Yorker cartoon, which many of you will have remembered. It shows sort of how New Yorkers view the world, which is basically we sort of see Manhattan, we see New Jersey, but then there's kind of the rest of the world. And I was really ignorant about culture growing up in Long Island. And I got really shaken out of that worldview in a very positive way when I went to London for a semester during my junior year. And I remember a conversation I had with my father telling him how much culture shock I was having, including that people were just going from London to Paris for the weekend. And he said something really important to me in his Brooklyn accent. He said, well, think about it like it's going from New York to Pennsylvania. And I thought, wow, what a great metaphor, Pop. And literally the next day, there's a true story. I booked a trip to Egypt by myself.
Oh my
and
goodness.
I told my dad, it's just like going from New York to California, Pop. Don't worry about it. And it was really, I really wanted to immerse myself in culture. And that's what I wound up doing. I really traveled around the world and I realized just how little I knew about this profound influence on my own behavior. And it actually caused me to change careers. I was pre-med at the time. And then I came back and I wound up deciding to go to get a Ph.D. in cross-cultural psychology with Harry Triandis in Champaign-Urbana. And the rest was history. So I really, like many people, recognized only culture when I got away from unculture. Like T.S. Eliot says, it's only when you kind of come back from a cultural experience that you realize that you have now understand the place you came from for the very first time.
Wow. It's funny. Yes. I guess growing up in New York, it was, I call Texas as country by itself. New York is a country by itself, particularly the Manhattan and the suburbs and the tiny culture. It's such a, amalgamation of many, many international experiences. But yes, you never know until you leave your country. And I'm so blessed that I got a chance to do that. So let's start with this very book. Tell us why you wrote this book, Rule Makers and Rule Breakers. And what is culture and what are cultural norms and why are they so important to study?
Well, I wrote this book for a general audience, first of all, because I feel like a lot of the work we do in academia gets kind of trapped in scientific journals that not a lot of people read. And my father, who influenced me very much, always complained he can't understand a word I'm saying about my work. So I wrote this book first and foremost to take what I think is really exciting cultural science and make it accessible for a general audience and to learn from a general audience about how these ideas resonate with you. And basically it was trying to get beyond some of these superficial distinctions that we think about when we think about culture, typically things like red versus blue or east versus west or rich versus poor. And I've been trying to understand for about 25 years, are there deeper cultural codes that are driving our behavior? And so over the last several decades, I've been studying hundreds of cultures from ancient Aztecs to Alabama, from Sparta to Singapore, and even from the military to Silicon Valley. And I do find that one very important distinction, among others in cultural psychology, is essentially the strictness with which we adhere to social norms. And social norms are these incredible devices that humans have developed. They're these unwritten, sometimes written rules for behavior. And what's so interesting about social norms is that they're omnipresent. They affect us all the time, but they're really invisible. We really take them for granted. We take it for granted, for example, that we put clothes on, most of us, when we walk outside during the day, and we drive on one side of the road versus both sides of the road at any one time, or that we don't have sex in public places in most places. We reserve that for private settings. And these are all social norms that we've invented. And they're really important for human groups because they help us to predict each other's behavior and to coordinate our behavior at an unprecedented in an unprecedented degree. They're the glue that keep us together. And what I've been studying, though, is that strength of that glue. And what I'm finding is that some groups have stronger social glue. They're what I call tight cultures. And other cultures tend to have weaker social glue. They're what we call loose cultures. And this distinction of tight loose is really important for understanding a wide range of differences, from nations to neurons, from politics to parenting, and everything in between.
So, as I'm listening to this, this made so much sense once I started reading your book. And thank you, by the way, for literally bringing this into our lives, because I think when people talk about culture, people literally talk about going to opera or something, they think being cultured.
Yeah.
But I think, I have to tell you a funny story. So when I work with lots of dysregulated children and adults, I do this therapy approach where I have this, little container for pickup sticks. And it's a metal container. And on top of that, I put this brown envelope upside down. So you can't see, it's just, used to hold that brown envelope. So and it's on the table. And so when the kid comes in, I say, how many people are in this room? And they'll say, they look at me funny and they say 2. And I said, no, there are 3 of us. And they are so surprised. And so I said, do you not see? I call it Eumeus. Eumeus is the name of this third person, which is you, me, and us. and so the Eumeus is, so when I discussed that, not interrupting the teacher, and the typical response for the student is that the teacher doesn't like me, rather than it's expected you to not interrupt the teacher. So I tell them that it is not Mrs. Smith who came up with this rule. It's not Sucheta who came up with this rule. It is the Eumeus who came up with this rule. And I think just to get them to understand that the rules are made by systems that are much larger than just simple you and I.
Yeah, that's such a great example because, norms are collective, and there's something that we develop over time. They're passed along generations. And it's remarkable because we start learning them from a very early age. There's some evidence in developmental psychology that even infants, before they have language, will start to reach for puppets who are behaving cooperatively with other puppets. And they will kind of ignore puppets that are beating up other puppets. By the time we're age 3, we start berating puppets that are violating norms. And so you can just think about norms as something that we start really developing our understanding of them. Most of us, of course, your populations tend to have problems with some of these issues. And I think it's fascinating to think about just how profoundly important social norms are for functioning in society. And for people that don't understand them, it could put them at a terrible disadvantage in terms of being ostracized, feeling punished, and really not understanding what are they doing wrong. So it's really, norms are so fundamental to human sociality that it's important to study them from all sorts of vantage points, from healthy functioning, but also dysfunction.
So I see it in 2 ways. It play out in the population where it's not going well for people. One is for example, the ADHD population, where the learning disability is such that their attention to detail is what is the weakness. And what that means is they may be aware of the social expectation. They're just too impulsive and too eager to violate them to self-serving ways. But in autism and spectrum disorders, they actually are unaware of the existing norms. So the therapeutic approach is very different, but both are designed to actually creating this attunement so that they become aware of the norms,
Yeah, exactly. That's right. I mean, I think that they require different solutions when you need to help people to adjust to norms that they just maybe not paying attention to, versus people who really don't understand the psychology of social norms. And I think that norms are at the basis of many different dysfunctions, including the opposite end of the extreme. Maybe there's also a pattern where people are hyper attentive to social norms, and that can also be somewhat dysfunctional. So it's interesting that in my work, I talk about something I call the Goldilocks principle of social norms, which is having balance in terms of how much freedom versus constraint we have. And so, for example, even at the level of societies, we find that groups that are really, really loose, that allow for a really wide range of behavior, they tend to be very unpredictable places and kind of chaotic. And at the opposite extreme, we have cultures where they're extremely tight and have a lot of repression. And those extremes tend to produce a lot of malfunctioning. This is now at the societal level, where they have higher suicide rates, they have lower happiness, higher blood pressure. And so even at the group level, there tends to be a need for some kind of balance between freedom and constraint. And when you get in either extreme, it can be problematic for societies more generally, even beyond the individual level.
I see. So can we go back a little bit and talk about tightness and looseness? So how does norm tightness appear? And can you give us examples of cultures where this exists? And then same with the looseness. And then help us understand as parents or educators are trying to raise children, how do these cultural references affect the way we parent or guide students or learners?
Yeah, this is a great question. And so in 2011, we published a paper in the journal Science trying to start to look at, can we place nations as a whole on a metric ranging on a continuum from tight to loose, with the idea that, of course, all cultures have some loose and some tight elements, but just like at the individual level where we can differentiate people who are more or less introverted or extroverted or other personality dimensions, we wanted to see, can we measure norm strength, tight and loose, how strict or permissive groups are around the world. Later, by the way, we started looking at this within nations. Can we differentiate the 50 states in terms of tight, loose, or social classes or organizations, or even our own households? And what's exciting more generally is that we can use this kind of simple lens to understand a wide range of phenomena. And in our study in Science, what we found was that groups like Japan, you mentioned, Singapore, Germany, Austria, they tended to veer tighter in our groups, in our data. Whereas groups like New Zealand and Brazil and the Netherlands and the United States in general tended to veer loose. And of course, again, all cultures have elements of both, but we can see that they vary on this continuum. And we were really interested in, what kind of signature do these kinds of cultures have? What liabilities and strengths do they confer to human groups? And we found really striking patterns across cultures. And later we see this within the states also. And that is this predictable trade-off that we call order versus openness. So for example, in tight cultures, we see that there's a lot of order, less crime, and more monitoring, like you described in your story, that keeps people behaving themselves. There's also more synchrony and uniformity in tight cultures, more synchrony in what people wear and what they drive, even more synchrony in the clocks on city streets. In tight cultures, the clocks on city streets in our data show pretty much the same time. But in loose cultures, they're pretty off. You're not totally
I
sure.
loved your example that in Brazil, I think you said that none of the street clocks watch, right?
Well, they're off by quite a bit. And this is a matter of synchrony and uniformity. And tight cultures also have a lot more impulse control. When you're worried about fitting in and not violating rules, you have to manage your impulses. And you're trained, to your point, from a very early age in schools, from parents, in other institutions in society to monitor your impulses. So we find there's more self-regulation in tight cultures, less debt, less obesity, less alcoholism, less lateness in schools, for example. And loose cultures struggle with these kinds of order issues. They have more crime, less monitoring, less synchrony, and more self-regulation problems. But on the flip side, we find loose cultures are much more open. They're open to different types of people, from immigrants to the disabled to the stigmatized. They're open to different ideas, they're more creative, and they're open to change, to new ideas that are changing. And it's tight cultures that struggle with these issues. So we could see a very predictable trade-off between order and openness at the national level, at the state level. And we were really excited to try to understand what causes these differences to evolve in the first place. Is there a logic, a rationale for why cultures evolve to be tight or loose? Because often when we look at cultural differences, like maybe your friend did also, or in many cases, we look at other practices, we think they're so strange. Why are they so strict? Or why are they so permissive? And we become very judgmental. And so understanding why cultures evolve the way they do and why it might make sense is really important to increasing empathy for other cultures and reducing ethnocentrism.
So do we know why tight cultures become tight and loose cultures become loose? Is that something to do with resources? Is that something to do with mindsets, attitudes?
Yeah, so it's multiply determined. But what we were looking at in this study in Science is we, for example, found there was no common tradition or religion or no common geography that united tight and loose cultures. Some tight cultures existed thousands of years ago, like Sparta, and loose cultures like Athens existed thousands of years ago. And so there's no commonality across time. But we did find a really important factor, and that had to do with how much threat groups face. And threat can be either from Mother Nature, think constant natural disasters like Japan experiences and famine and tsunamis. Or it could be human-made threat. How many times has your nation been potentially invaded by its neighbors?
Nice.
Or pathogen prevalence or population density. And what's really simple about this sort of concept is that when you have a lot of threat and it's collective threat, you can't solve these issues on your own as a person. You need strong rules to coordinate to survive. And that's what we found. In general, tight cultures tend to have more threat. Loose cultures tend to have less threat. They also tend to have more diversity and more mobility. And this, again, tends to apply not just to the national level, but to the state level. It applies across many different levels of analysis. And again, it can help us to be more empathic, because if you live in a context where you are faced with all those threats, you can understand why it is that people would want to have stricter rules in order to coordinate.
And what's interesting, as I was reading that the threat may go away, but the ingrained cultural traces, I guess, don't go away. Is that right?
Yeah, it's a really important point. Tight loose is really dynamic. So we could see that, in fact, even in the US, which tends to be loose, we have pockets of tightness I can talk about. In certain states, definitely have more natural disasters and pathogens, and this predicts tightness among other variables. But even in the United States, we could see after the Boston bombing, for example, a desire for tightening. In my own laboratory, I can activate fake threats like population density on my own campus or terrorism threats. And I can see within minutes that people want stronger rules and even more autocratic leaders to help coordinate to survive. So it's really interesting that the same sort of temporary threat can produce the same tightening. The issue is that it will dissipate in most cases over time if it's not a chronic threat. Although it does, to your point, in our computational models, we could see that it takes longer to go from tight to loose as threat is decreasing than it does from going from loose to tight. So there seems to be kind of a risk aversion, wanting to hold on to those rules, even when threat is not there chronically. But that is a really important, point in the book that I try to make, because a lot of what we see around the world now with increasing populism and with desire for autocrats is not really explained by, in my view, by some mesmerizing personalities or some kind of historical moment that's strange. It's really based within this psychology of tightness. In fact, we've seen before the Trump election, when people who felt threatened, whether by ISIS or by North Korea or immigrants, they felt the US was too loose. And that in turn predicted their support for Trump. And it was the same exact pattern in France. And so you could see this dynamic of threat and tightness playing out, not just in societies and in ancient pre-industrial societies in our data, but even in our own electoral dynamics.
You know what, I have found this so interesting that here we are as our group, collective psychology, I guess, that when we feel threatened, we bond together, we come together, we impose stringent rules on ourselves, we expect a lot more greater adherence. And then we kind of get tired of it. We feel we are stifled and we want creativity and individualism. And then we fight and liberate ourselves. But then again, so it waxes and wanes. And I feel like both places we have something to complain about.
Well, that's right. Because, if we're tightening unnecessarily, then that is producing that sort of deficit in what we know with the tight loose trade-off. That makes us less creative, less innovative. It makes us more ethnocentric. And so we need to try to strike a balance between tight and loose. To your point, sometimes when we veer in either direction, there's some pendulum shifts that we could see happening. And so I think what's exciting about norm psychology now is once we understand the distinctions between tight and loose and other cultural psychology theories, we can use these theories actively to negotiate our worlds. For example, in our own household, I'll just say in my house, I veer kind of loose and my husband veers kind of tight. And for very good reasons that we could talk about and empathize with each other. But the key here is that we can actively discuss and negotiate the norm strength in our household. What domains need to be tight? What domains can we be looser in? Can we talk to our kids about this? I mean, it sounds a little bit cheesy, but that's what we do in this household. We have certain domains that we agreed on, we got to be strict about, but we're going to loosen up on others. And that it can apply this kind of agency, this agentic approach to social norms to other contexts. For example, I think we need to do, and this is covered in Rule Makers, Rule Breakers, in the last part of the book, is to really think about actively negotiating norms that have gotten too loose, that we might need to insert some So more regulation, more accountability. And also on the flip side, to actively negotiate norms that perhaps have gotten too tight within our society. So the internet is a really good example. In many ways, it's kind of a wild, wild west of anti-normative behavior. And it's not too surprising. Psychologists have known for decades that when you're not being monitored, that you do all sorts of weird things. And we see that on the internet. And
Yes.
it offers a great amount of advantages in terms of efficiencies and connectivity, but it also is suffering, in my view, from normlessness, from extreme looseness. And in fact, in some of our recent data that my undergraduates just presented, we found that it's not the amount of time that you spend online that is related to depression and loneliness. It's how much normlessness you perceive
Wow.
online. And so it's what's interesting. Now we're trying to do some research on how do you nudge this kind of more normative behavior online without sacrificing freedom and diversity and debate. To your point, like trying to have some kind of balance between the two. And I think we can do it. I'm an optimist. It will take a while. It will take a while, but we've learned as humans to adapt to so many different contexts. We scaled up from very, very small tribal groups to interacting with strangers, and norms helped us to do that. Now we live online, so we have to do it again in this context, and we have to seek that balance.
When my husband and I, we met in India, we are married. We came to US when we were married, but he comes from within India. He and I don't speak the same language. We don't dress the same way. We don't have the same norms in the household. We don't eat the same food, but we, got together. And what was distinct to me that one simple example I'll give is when we went to other people's house for dinner or invitation or whatever the occasion might be, we never went empty-handed. That was our culture. And when I got married, I was petrified that my husband, my in-laws, nobody ever reciprocates or offers anything. But not that they're rude or stingy or none of that. It's just the culture. So when my husband and I, when we moved to US, we literally had to, I have two young adults, 20 and 23-year-olds, and we had to discuss what kind of norms we will have for them. Because the way I grew up in a very tighter household than my husband did. And so I'm very much, follow the, parents are the boss and you have the rules and you cannot violate them, and a lot of expectations of appropriateness. And my husband, everything was okay. So we had to decide in America, what is it that going to be? And what I love about your book, as well as you're speaking, that there has to be active discussion and negotiation. And I think that's the missing link. I find that even teachers who are trying to regulate a classroom of students who come from different cultural backgrounds, or they're imparting their own classroom culture, they don't have explicit discussions regarding that culture.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that? How can we create an active negotiation in the classroom or at home when we are within the United States and within a classroom of a particular school, but there are children who are behaving in varied ways, and some are creating a ruckus and some are not getting the attention they deserve because of those who create a ruckus?
Yeah. It's really, it gets back to this point that we sort of ignore culture. It's so profoundly important, but it's invisible. We focus a lot on IQ or maybe, emotional intelligence. And we really are very proud of all our technological achievements as humans. We've split the atom and we've wired the earth, and we've even trained dogs to ride skateboards. But we have to really now shift our attention to perhaps one of the more important issues in our society, which is our cultures and our cultural differences, and how to really understand them and manage them in all sorts of contexts. It's interesting, and I'll get back to schools in a minute, but I study organizations, and we look at people who are sent abroad for international assignments, and it's the same issue. We find that a lot of people are sent away for their technical competence, not because they necessarily have cultural intelligence, which is a new field of study in my area. And we could see, by the way, that when people are sent abroad, especially going to tight cultures, and they're really not used to them, they can really suffer in terms of their adjustments. And that's really important to be able to anticipate, and we can anticipate it if we start talking serious about culture. And that applies to our schools too. A lot of the times in the United States, where we're a multicultural society, kids are coming from all sorts of different backgrounds, and kids who come from very tight cultures at home and trying to adapt to the looseness of American classrooms or vice versa could really be suffering. And teachers need to understand and be mindful of where kids are coming from so they can help them to adapt to these cultures and explain to them why the classroom is structured the way it is and how to structure the classroom so that it helps kids adjust and helps them understand and not blame themselves for feeling, in a sense, like a fish out of water.
This reminds me of another story that my brother who came here for a job, and he didn't go to school here like I did, but he works for a very large Indian technology company, and they sent a brand new, VP of operations or whatever directly from India. And this young man, not quite young, but 45-year-old, he had not traveled outside the country. He assumed this was United States and everybody drinks. And so first day, the night before he was about to start his job, he was invited to this welcome party. And at that party, he got smashed drunk. And this is probably his first time, because he assumed everybody in the United States, this is a way to celebrate with employees, something he would never do in India, never would drink at a job party in the first place. And it was so funny, he got fired.
Oh my gosh.
He was sent home for being inappropriate.
It's such an interesting story because a lot of times people kind of do what we call overshooting. They have some stereotype of the culture there's always a grain of, truth to that stereotype that Americans drink more than people in India. And we know that, but also exaggerating that stereotypes because we tend to meet in the media and we look at all these crazy movies and we think Americans are half naked all the time or they're drinking I actually have data from Pakistanis and Americans about stereotypes that have each other that's about to be published. And it was a really interesting study because we found that Americans not only thought Pakistanis were tight, but they thought they were only in mosques most of the time. They didn't imagine Pakistanis playing sports or reading poetry. And Pakistanis also, again, they thought Americans weren't just loose, but they were half naked and they were drinking and they were never with their parents or calling the police on their parents for being too strict. And, what we did was a really fascinating study because we ended up developing something called a daily diary technique where we had Pakistanis read American diaries, real diaries, unedited diaries, or they read Pakistani diaries. And Americans, on the flip side, either read Pakistani diaries. Every day they were flashed what was going on with their Pakistani counterpart, or they read American diaries. And again, they were unedited. And they did vary on tight loose and how strict or permissive they were, but they were much more detailed and had many more commonalities in terms of people experiencing anxiety or people playing sports or people being on the internet. And what we found, which was really exciting, is that over time, people who read each other's diaries from another culture really came to see each other as much more similar. They reduced their cultural distance and they really reduced negative stereotyping about each other, even though they still recognize that they're different. They had way more sort of calibration on what the culture was like. And I think daily diaries are an interesting technique because they really help you get a window into another person's real life that you can't get in the media.
Oh my God, I love it. So let's bring this to close with this connection with executive function. So there are two primitive or most essential executive function skills, which is impulse control and perspective taking. And as you were describing this, the aspect of cultural regulation, I feel at the neuropsychological level, you need to really control your impulses to adhere to these invisible rules. So you're not selfish and driven, but you're also complying with the expectations and benefit of the other. Mm-hmm. And then the perspective shift that you just described through this diary experiment, for example, a kind of activating knowledge of other people's experiences, which may be radically or somewhat different, and adjusting and retweaking your own perspective of them. So how does this translate into code switching? Or do we call that code switching? Or how do we kind of level up in our cultural responsivity, if I may say that?
Yeah, it's really interesting because I wanted to mention, we've been looking at how culture is ingrained, how norms are ingrained with some neuroscience research. And I think it's really important to recognize these things become really patterned in the brain based on chronic exposure to strong norms. We see that, for example, in our comparisons of Chinese and in China and Americans, that when we're asking people about their reactions to norm violating behavior. For example, Michelle shouting in the library versus Michelle studying in the library. That the N400 response, this is a negative deflection, 400 milliseconds, which is indicative of some kind of incongruity that you're detecting in the environment, is much more strongly found in China in the frontal area than it is in the US. And by the way, that neural activity is predictive of ratings of self-control that, in our samples, Chinese have higher self-control, and it's in part mediated by their detection of social norm violations, even in the frontal area of the brain.
Wow, absolutely.
And so I think that it's interesting to think about how, these things are ingrained and they tend to become very stable. In our research, by the way, in social class, we can see that by age 3, the working class kids that we bring into our laboratory who are their parents are trying to avoid hard living, avoid poverty. They trying to have strict rules in their households so that kids can really survive those difficult contexts. Those kids actually exhibit tighter patterns by 3 years of age. We have them, by the way, interacting with a puppet. And the puppet is playing with them these new games. And then the puppet does something kind of weird. It starts violating the rules. And we simply look at how does the kid react to the puppet who's violating rules. And the working class kids by age 3 are already more upset when they see these norm violations than the upper class kids who have a cushion and they can afford to break rules because they have a safety net. So on the one hand, it's important to recognize that culture evolves very early on and we have stable patterns that we can detect. At the same time, like we said earlier, we can negotiate culture. If we're in a tight context, we can think about where could we have more discretion in this system, in this family, or in this organization, or in the nation. I call this basically flexible tightness. In a sense, we want to have tightness in some contexts, it's a greater threat, but we need to somehow have some more autonomy. Even in the military, who I work with now, the Navy needs to have a lot of rules to coordinate. There's a lot of safety issues, but the question is, how can we diagnose certain domains where we can have more latitude to allow for more creativity in those contexts? Or on the flip side, some loose contexts, need some more structure. I call this structured looseness. And, we may have a loose culture because we can afford to, but we might want to have more monitoring, more accountability, more benchmarks. In organizational world, I highlight like Tesla or Uber as good examples of places that are really pretty loose and can use a little bit more tightness. Or on the flip side, United Airlines is on the other sense, it was getting really tight and where people were following norms without thinking about it, where they needed some more looseness. So what's exciting is to think about how to negotiate this for a more healthy balance for kids, for our organizations, for our world as a whole.
So you sound very optimistic and you're seeing results. So who decides to loosen the rules? Who is in charge of negotiating the culture? Somebody lower on the totem pole or somebody higher on the totem pole? Is there any directionality of that?
Well, it's really something I think can happen from top down or from bottom up. We know that a lot of changes, and I talk about in the book, that happen in organizations who realize that they need to shift in their norm strength in either direction, that it's coming from top down, from people who are able to communicate the importance of change, who help deal with the underlying threats that people feel during those changes. So, for example, people going from tighter to looser feel like they're losing some control, and that's pretty scary. People going from loose to tight, they feel like their autonomy is being challenged. So the best leaders are able to deal with those kinds of perceived threats and help negotiate why this is important. And again, why their common core is going to stay similar, but they're going to actually have some also of the benefits of the alternative cultural code for their functioning. But it can also happen in a very bottom-up way where you're on a team and you recognize, for example, that, we seem to be really uncoordinated and we keep missing deadlines. And in the book, I talk about ways that, even people, in more kind of lower levels of the organization can start to talk about the importance of these things and change and make a difference. And I think using the terminology, helping to identify norms, the strength of norms, where they come from, their consequences, can help people to start having these kinds of dialogues. One thing I wanted to mention is that on my website, which is michellegelfand.com, I have a tight loose mindset quiz because as we talked about earlier in the conversation, understanding culture starts with understanding yourself. Like, where are you on the default tight loose mindset continuum? I mean, of course, we all navigate the strength of norms in our daily life. When we're in a library, we tighten up versus when we're in a public, pool or a park. But nevertheless, we each have our own default setting based on our culture, our background, our gender, our occupation. And the quiz is based on some of the data from my science paper and helps people to understand what's your sort of natural preference. Actually, I use in the book Dahlia Litwick, the Slate writer's metaphor of, are you a chaos Muppet or an order Muppet?
Yes, I love that.
And,
Tell us a little bit about that. That's so good.
I think, again, we shift based on the situation, but we each have our own default setting on, the chaos Muppet tends to, kind of not really notice rules as much and maybe seems a little more impulsive and risk taking and also is very much okay with ambiguity. You think about, Cookie Monster and Animal as the Chaos Muppet. On the flip side, the Order Muppets like Kermit the Frog and Bert, they're more attentive to rules. They're attentive to their impulses and trying to fit in more. And they also like structure and order. And so once you detect where your default is, you can start thinking about where does that come from? And maybe again, at the individual level, where might I loosen up or tighten up depending on where I fall in this continuum? And then of course, this helps to understand the people that we're most closely connected with. That tight loose causes a lot of conflict in everyday life, from finances to parenting to vacations. I can say personally that, in our big family vacations, there's huge conflicts over spontaneity and structure. And it really relates to tight loose. And we have to negotiate these differences, even in our own families, let alone in-laws, like the stories you told, or, in other contexts. And, it's also important to think about your default setting because we are embedded in communities that are tight or loose, in organizations that veer in these directions, in states. And it's useful to think about the match that people have. How congruent is your own default mindset with those that are around you? And I think that's really opens up a whole lot in terms of self-understanding about where we personally are calibrated for a lot of reasons on the strength of norms, and then how to use that knowledge to build more effective relationships and happiness.
I'll tell you a funny story that I saw. I don't know if you ever see the It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia show. No. Oh my God, it's ridiculous. Do not even watch it. It'll ruin you for life. But anyway, these are a group of 4 inappropriate people, basically. There's a father, he has 2 twins. I guess he has a set of twins, a girl and a boy, and then they're 2 friends. So they're running a bar in Philadelphia, and they're just generally uneducated, not very smart or witty, but just have lots of kind of prejudices against many, many things. So there's a scene where the twins discover that their mother had an affair, and the father is Danny DeVito, which is, 4'11", and then the mother is like maybe 5'5". I forget the actress. So they discover that he's not their father. So they decide to confront the father, or rather let him know that they think the mother had an affair. So they choose this very fancy restaurant. Okay. So they arrive there. And so the sister says, this is like a really fancy restaurant. He says, yeah, at least here he will not create a scene. And right. Of course, he does create a scene. So, yeah, I think we are expecting that sometimes culture will put a limit on people and they will behave themselves, and then there are some people who still don't.
By the way, I have to say that, once you start thinking about norms, you really can't. For me, I can't stop thinking about them. I'll be in a restaurant in Germany and I'm tempted to just try to violate a norm. Go in and ask someone for one of their French fries and see how they react, because we take it for granted that we're following norms, many of us, for much of our life. And we don't tend to realize how important they are, that, societies couldn't function without them. Families would splinter, organizations, police, we couldn't have these kind of effective structures unless we share this expectation on what's appropriate or inappropriate. And, it's so profound. Even things like, why do we wear a white dress, most of us in the United States, on the happiest day of our life when we're getting married? Like, why do we, in the book, I could provide a lot of examples. Why do we cut down good trees and let them die in our living room, on the 25th of December in many households? Like, there's just so many interesting rules that we develop and that we just don't even think about. And so if you sort of start thinking about norms, it really helps you to see the world in a totally different way. And I hope rule breakers does that. And I want to mention that on my website, I also have a place that people can send me their stories about tight loose. And I really would appreciate any stories that you have, the audience, about this distinction and how it's affected your life, because that's one of the most rewarding things about having written this book, is to get feedback from you and stories and ideas. And, we'll do research on them. We're really fired up to do research on all things Tight Loose. And we just love to hear from you. So please check out the website and send in some notes and emails to me.
Well, I am sure you're going to get a lot of stories. I think I single-handedly could give you a lot of stories from having, traveled through many cultures. So, Michele, I cannot thank you for being on this podcast and really so enthusiastically sharing your knowledge, your wisdom, and giving us this important perspective that without the context of a culture, we cannot even improve behaviors and improve attitudes and understand even why people, what are the motivational forces behind people doing the way they do or systems the way they run. So thank you very, very much for being on this podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
All right, that's all the time we have for today. If you are enjoying this podcast, we would really appreciate it if you could share it with your friends and family and perhaps others who might benefit from it. All right, so on behalf of our host, Michele Gelfand, today's guest, Dr. Michele Gelfand, and all of us, that's Cerebral Matters. Thanks for listening today, and we look forward to seeing you again right here next week on Full PreFrontal.
Thank you for listening to Full PreFrontal, exposing the mysteries of executive functions. To contact our host, Michele Gelfand, and learn more about her work on improving executive functions, visit her website at cerebralmatters.com. That's cerebralmatters.com. Tune in next week for the next informative episode of Full PreFrontal.